Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different, something that's equal parts unsettling and oddly soothing. So dim the lights, grab a blanket if you like, and settle in. We're going to float gently into the world of ancient beauty, the kind of beauty routines that were luxurious, extravagant, and, in a lot of cases, quietly lethal. Now, when we think about beauty in history, we often picture delicate aristocrats applying perfumed oils, or maybe a Greek philosopher sighing over the perfect nose. But the truth is a little more complicated. And by complicated, I mean there's lead, arsenic, and sometimes, yes, a little self-destruction mixed in. So as we drift through this story tonight, just keep in mind, beauty has always been more than skin deep. Sometimes it went all the way to the bones. Let's start with ancient Rome. Because why not kick things off with the people who basically invented the extravagant lifestyle blueprint? Roman women, especially those of the upper class, had quite the approach to looking beautiful. They adored pale skin because apparently being indoors all day doing nothing was a status symbol. To achieve this ethereal pallor, women didn't just wear light powders. They lathered their faces with a concoction containing lead. Yes, lead. Because nothing says I'm a refined patrician like slowly poisoning yourself for cosmetic reasons. And of course, they didn't stop there. For a little extra dramatic effect, they would sometimes apply white lead to their bodies too, giving themselves that ghostly elegance, vibe, that in hindsight might have just been a subtle invitation for organ failure. Hair was another Roman obsession. Long, flowing locks were mandatory, preferably blonde. Since natural blondes were rarer than a functioning senate these days, Roman women often dyed their hair with goat fat mixed with beech wood ashes. It was a subtle, smoky scent, which, if you're imagining a spa experience, well, it probably wasn't. And of course, some women went the extra mile and added wigs made from the hair of conquered Gauls or other unfortunate foreigners. Because nothing screams sophistication like wearing someone else's head hair. Speaking of extreme, let's float over to Japan for a moment. Because if you thought Romans were intense, you haven't met the Heian court ladies. Around the 10th century, their beauty ideals were, well, let's just say a little obsessive. They wanted faces as white as paper and teeth as black as ink. That's right. Blackened teeth were considered alluring, sophisticated, and entirely necessary. The process, called ohaguro, involved dipping teeth in a mixture of iron filings and vinegar until they achieved that perfect inky sheen. It sounds, and is, quite unappetizing. But hey, aesthetics over taste, apparently. Meanwhile, hair was grown so long that walking required a minor choreography to avoid tripping over it. Of course, Europe wasn't innocent in the beauty madness department. During the Renaissance, pale skin became a rigid status marker once again. Women applied layers of white lead-based foundation, sometimes so thick that it actually cracked when they smiled. And if you were really dedicated, you might also paint delicate veins onto your skin to give the impression of a healthy, aristocratic fragility. They also had the fun little habit of shaving their hairlines back to create that wide, high forehead, because apparently looking vaguely alien was very chic. Meanwhile, in ancient China, things took a slightly different but equally obsessive turn. Foot binding, which began in the Song dynasty, is probably the most famous example. Tiny, curled feet were considered the pinnacle of feminine allure. Starting as early as age 5 or 6, girls' feet were tightly bound with cloth, breaking bones and curling toes underneath. The goal was a lotus foot, about 3 inches long. It's tempting to imagine this as a quaint cultural tradition, but in reality, it caused lifelong pain, difficulty walking, and occasional infections. Yet, in a society obsessed with marital prospects and beauty standards, it was considered absolutely worth it. And of course, the smaller the foot, the higher the social cachet. Back to Europe for a moment. Let's not forget the Elizabethans. Queen Elizabeth I herself was a master of extreme beauty. She painted her face white with a mixture containing white lead, vinegar, and sometimes egg whites. Her red wigs were legendary, largely because her natural hair color wasn't red enough to achieve the dramatic, fiery look she wanted. And naturally, since she was royalty, she expected her ladies-in-waiting to follow the same regimen. Of course, all this lead-based makeup sometimes resulted in a slightly deteriorated face and, on occasion, lead poisoning. But hey, power overrode minor inconveniences like brain damage. Even simpler, everyday cosmetics in history could be quietly dangerous. Kohl, used across North Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, was applied around the eyes to darken and accentuate them. While it looked striking, Kohl sometimes contained lead or antimony, which, again, was slowly poisonous. And yet, despite this, it was ubiquitous, because apparently nothing says I'm a respected member of society quite like toxic eyeliner. And let's drift for a moment to a more peculiar obsession: eyebrows. Ancient civilizations often went to extreme lengths here too. In Persia, women would dye their eyebrows black using a mixture that included soot and animal fat. In Elizabethan England, some women plucked almost every single eyebrow hair and redrew them higher on the forehead to give a more aristocratic look. And yes, the higher, the better, because nothing says I am a noble woman like the constant risk of accidentally poking yourself in the eye. Now, you might be wondering, were there men in this beauty chaos? Absolutely. Roman men, especially the elite, shaved their faces meticulously, dyed their hair, and sometimes even applied powders to appear more refined. Chinese emperors occasionally whitened their faces and plucked stray hairs, and in Elizabethan England, men used lead-based powders and wore wigs. Basically, if you were anyone who mattered, vanity was non-negotiable. And yes, it sometimes shortened lifespans, but that was a small price to pay for societal approval. Let's float over to another royal disaster: Cleopatra. She's remembered for her cunning, political prowess, and legendary beauty. But in reality, ancient coins and descriptions suggest her allure may have been less about perfect skin and symmetrical features, and more about charisma, intelligence, and a very strategic application of eyeliner. Cleopatra did, however, indulge in lavish beauty treatments. Milk baths, oils, and honey masks were daily routines. And while none of these were lethal, they were certainly sticky, uncomfortable, and expensive. But then again, when you're the Queen of Egypt, expense is basically irrelevant. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, upper-class women had beauty routines that included bathing in scented oils and adorning themselves with elaborate jewelry. But they also used kohl around their eyes, again, with lead content. It's fascinating to watch a recurring theme. The higher the social status, the more likely you were to be slowly poisoned by your own vanity. And here's a little twist: Not some were socially mandated, politically motivated, or used to manipulate perception. In many societies, the ability to maintain elaborate beauty routines indicated wealth, control over servants, or social influence. So, in a sense, enduring slightly hazardous makeup, bone-crushing foot binding, or toxic powders was a performance of power. And if you were unlucky, it was also a performance that might shorten your life. The contrast between ideals and reality is quietly tragic, and sometimes gently funny. The aristocrat obsessed with whiteness who slowly turns gray from lead poisoning. The girl with bound feet navigating the household like a delicate marionette. The Roman patrician layering goat fat and ash into her hair. These are people who pursued beauty obsessively, often with little regard for health, comfort, or common sense. And yet, in every case, it's oddly relatable. We all chase societal approval in one way or another, though thankfully most of us don't do it with arsenic or broken toes. Of course, not all historical beauty was harmful. Perfumes, oils, and herbal treatments were generally safe, and some practices, like hairstyling or adornment with jewelry, were purely aesthetic. But the recurring theme across cultures and centuries is that extreme beauty almost always came with extreme consequences. Sometimes that consequence was social exclusion if you failed, sometimes physical pain, and sometimes, quietly, early mortality. And so, as we drift through these sleepy hours tonight, it's fascinating to notice how similar people were across time and space. The desire to appear attractive, to signal status, to impress peers, these impulses haven't changed much. Only the methods and the degree of risk involved have. Lead, arsenic, broken bones, blackened teeth. History is full of examples that are equal parts horrifying and mesmerizing in their commitment. So as we slowly glide from Rome to Heian, Japan, to China and Elizabethan England, remember, beauty has always been more than just skin deep. Sometimes it's bone deep. Sometimes it's fatal. And sometimes it's a story you can almost whisper through a calm, late-night voice, letting the absurdity of human vanity lull you into gentle contemplation. We'll continue in the next part with more tales of extreme aesthetics, Renaissance perfumes, Victorian corsets, and maybe a touch of powdered wig madness. For now, let your mind wander through the faint scent of oils, ashes, and vinegar, and imagine the long, quiet rituals that shaped centuries of beauty ideals. All right, friends, let's drift gently forward in time, leaving ancient Rome, Japan, and Egypt behind, and settle into the slightly stuffier, yet equally obsessive world of Renaissance and early modern Europe. It's the period where powdered faces, high collars, and general human eccentricity reach, well, a level that is very polite to observe while sitting in a comfortable chair and letting your eyes grow heavy. The Renaissance, of course, was famous for its art, culture, and, as we're about to see, slightly alarming beauty practices. Pale skin was still the gold standard. Why? Well, it indicated you weren't working in the fields and getting sunburned like a commoner. If your face wasn't white as porcelain, you were probably doomed to an eternity of social judgment. So what did women do? They painted themselves. A lot. Lead-based cosmetics made a triumphant return. It was basically the ancient version of Instagram filters, only slightly more dangerous and with a better chance of causing anemia or death. One favorite Renaissance trick involved mixing white lead with vinegar and sometimes even chalk to achieve that perfect ghostly pallor. If the skin started peeling or turning slightly, it was considered a minor inconvenience. And while all this sounds extreme, it was also socially necessary. Marrying well, attracting attention at court, or maintaining a household of adoring servants often depended on whether your complexion screamed, "I am delicate and aristocratic," rather than, "I just harvested turnips in the rain." And let's not forget hair. Renaissance women sometimes went to extraordinary lengths to achieve the ideal hairline. High foreheads were in fashion, so ladies would pluck their hairlines mercilessly or shave them back entirely. Wigs became increasingly popular, often made from the hair of peasants or animals. The more elaborate the wig, the higher your status. And if you think this was just inconvenient, consider that wigs were sometimes so courtly men would powder their hair and faces, wear tightly laced jackets, and sometimes even dye their facial hair to match. Because nothing says powerful nobleman like a slightly toxic face and perfectly synchronized powdered beard. The Renaissance really was a golden age of vanity, wrapped in silk, paint, and mild arsenic exposure. Now, let's float forward a bit to the Elizabethan era, which is slightly more familiar, but no less extreme. Queen Elizabeth I was, in a word, obsessed. Her signature white face was achieved using a paste made from white lead and vinegar. Naturally, this often caused rashes and mild poisoning, but to the Queen, appearances were everything. Red wigs were used to cover thinning hair, and pale skin with a slightly cracked texture became a mark of nobility. Ladies-in-waiting, of course, had to follow suit. If they didn't, the social consequences could range from mild judgment to complete invisibility at court balls, which, in that era, was basically a social death sentence. Lip color, eye makeup, and even facial hair removal were also heavily policed by fashion. Women would pluck every stray hair and sometimes even paint on faint eyebrows or mustaches to create a controlled, deliberate aesthetic. And yes, the powder, paint, and plucking sometimes led to minor infections, irritation, or an overall sense of existential fatigue. But as with most beauty regimes in history, pain was often considered a mark of dedication and class. Moving gently into the 17th and 18th centuries, powdered wigs and extreme hairstyles dominate our sleepy narrative. French aristocrats took hair to a level that might make a modern stylist weep. Wigs could reach 3 feet high and were often infused with scented powders, sometimes mixed with flour or starch. These towers of hair were frequently adorned with miniature ships, birds, or decorative objects, depending on whim or political allegiances. Because, obviously, if you were wealthy enough to afford it, why not make your head a small habitat for sea creatures? Powder itself was not merely decorative. It was a way to mask odors, because bathing was often considered unnecessary or even unhealthy. So aristocrats would layer fine powders over their hair and face to hide the mild but persistent scent of humanity. The powder sometimes contained lead, so there's that recurring theme again: beauty and danger walking hand in hand. Or perhaps powder in hair and slow poisoning walking hand in hand. Corsets also entered the story at this point. They were a staple of aristocratic beauty. The idea was to mold the torso into a perfect hourglass, cinching in the waist to impossibly small proportions. Women often endured hours of tight lacing, which could restrict breathing, crush organs, and make sitting down a strategic exercise. Yet, a small waist was considered the pinnacle of elegance, so many women simply accepted that discomfort as the price of social survival. Gentle reminder, this is centuries before ergonomics became a thing. Perfumes, however, were somewhat safer, if still intense. Aristocrats used perfumes to mask bodily odors caused by infrequent bathing. Lavender, rosemary, and musk were popular choices. Some were applied liberally, filling rooms with a heavy, almost soporific scent. Imagine drifting through Versailles, slowly inhaling a bouquet that's part lavender, part heavy musk, part slightly worrying chemicals. It's relaxing in a strange, historical sort of way. Meanwhile, in the Americas, indigenous beauty standards were entirely different, but equally fascinating. Among the Maya, for example, cranial shaping was a common practice. Infants' heads were bound with cloth to elongate the skull. It was considered beautiful and a mark of status. Teeth could be filed into points or inlaid with jade. And while these procedures were permanent, they were generally safe if done carefully. Just another reminder that extreme is relative, and beauty rituals can range from hazardous to merely inconvenient. Returning to Europe, the Victorian era brought its own set of peculiar obsessions. Pale skin remained fashionable, but now the obsession extended to hair removal. Women removed facial hair, arms, and sometimes even eyelashes, depending on the whim of the latest fashion manual. And of course, chemical hair removers were often caustic and occasionally poisonous. Corsetry continued, sometimes even more extreme than before, with some Victorian ladies experiencing fainting spells, dizziness, or a general sense of existential weariness from prolonged tight lacing. Makeup in Victorian England was tricky because modesty was prized. Overt cosmetics were frowned upon, so women devised subtle methods. They'd use light powders, small touches of rouge, and occasionally a tint on the lips. The key was to appear naturally perfect, a challenge given that subtlety often required a quiet but steady application of potentially dangerous substances. Again, beauty was effortful, socially dictated, and sometimes quietly perilous. And let's drift toward another curious obsession, the obsession with teeth. In France and England, aristocrats sometimes dyed their teeth black or removed them entirely to conform to changing beauty ideals. Meanwhile, others whitened their teeth with abrasive powders, sometimes containing chalk, pumice, or even mildly toxic chemicals. Dental hygiene was less about health and more about aesthetics. After all, an aristocrat with discolored teeth was still a noble, but perhaps a slightly less impressive one at court. Let's pause for a moment to reflect, very softly, on the pattern emerging here. Across continents, centuries, and dynasties, the pursuit of beauty has involved dedication, discomfort, and sometimes outright danger. Lead, arsenic, tight corsets, bound feet, elongated skulls, blackened teeth. A global obsession with appearance seems to have consistently outweighed concerns about comfort, health, or even longevity. And yet, these practices were embedded deeply in social structures, reflecting status, identity, and personal agency. In other words, vanity has always been a serious business. Finally, for tonight's drifting thoughts, let's touch on one of the most quietly tragic and ironic aspects of historical beauty, the interplay between ideals and reality. The woman who spent hours painting herself with lead-based powders would often look ethereal and perfect, but her internal organs quietly protested. The girl with bound feet might move delicately and attract admiration while silently navigating daily discomfort. The man with a towering wig and scented powder might seem powerful while dealing with headaches, itching, or mild poisoning. In every case, the pursuit of beauty was both a statement of control and a surrender to societal pressures, often in equal measure. So as your eyelids grow heavier and the slow rhythm of history lulls you further, imagine these long routines, these elaborate rituals, and the quiet, sometimes absurd lengths people went to just to be considered beautiful. And remember, there's a gentle universality in all of it. The human desire to be admired, to fit in, to assert status, that's never changed. Only the methods have. In the next part, we'll explore more 19th and 20th century extremes, Victorian hair dye disasters, early cosmetics in the Roaring Twenties, and some of the more unusual medicalized beauty treatments that quietly shaped modern standards. For now, let the image of powdered faces, tight corsets, and elongated skulls drift through your mind like a soft, historical cloud. Discomfort. The man with a towering wig and scented powder might seem powerful, while dealing with headaches, itching, or mild poisoning. In every case, the pursuit of beauty was both a statement of control and a surrender to societal pressures, often in equal measure. So, as your eyelids grow heavier and the slow rhythm of history lulls you further, imagine these long routines, these elaborate rituals, and the quiet, sometimes absurd lengths people went to just to be considered beautiful. And remember, there's a gentle universality in all of it. The human desire to be admired, to fit in, to assert status, that's never changed. Only the methods have. In the next part, we'll explore more 19th and 20th century extremes, Victorian hair dye disasters, early cosmetics in the Roaring Twenties, and some of the more unusual medicalized beauty treatments that quietly shaped modern standards. For now, let the image of powdered faces, tight corsets, and elongated skulls drift through your mind like a soft historical cloud. All right, friends, let's continue our gentle drift through time, gliding from the powdered wigs, corsets, and blackened teeth of the Renaissance and Elizabethan courts into the slightly tighter, slightly more chemically adventurous world of Victorian and early 20th century beauty. So, pull your blanket a little tighter, sip some lukewarm tea if you like, and imagine yourself wandering through a museum of aesthetic extremities, quietly, softly, without judgment. Victorian England, as you might expect, had a peculiar combination of prudishness and obsession. Women were supposed to be delicate, modest, and eternally pale. Bathing, ironically, was considered potentially dangerous. The logic was that warm water could open the pores and allow illness to seep into the body. A charmingly counterintuitive idea. So, instead of regular bathing, aristocratic women used perfumes, powders, and layers of clothing to mask bodily odors. It was a subtle perfume and powder armor, applied meticulously to appear effortlessly perfect, while actually concealing an ever-so-slight funk. Corsets were, of course, central to this aesthetic. By the mid-19th century, extreme tight-lacing became a quiet art form. Some women cinched their waists down to astonishingly small proportions, earning the nickname wasp-waisted among polite society. The effect was a dramatic hourglass silhouette, often achieved at the cost of bruised ribs, restricted breathing, and occasionally fainting at inconvenient social events. Yet, like so many historical beauty practices, the pain was part of the allure. Suffering elegantly was considered, if you'll forgive the phrasing, a social virtue. Hair, meanwhile, remained a domain of subtle madness. Victorian women often dyed their hair using chemicals that would make a modern chemist shudder. Henna was common and relatively safe, but more adventurous tints relied on lead, mercury, and other heavy metals. It's quiet, slow poison again, a recurring theme in our history of beauty. Hair was also elaborately styled, frequently piled high on the head with the aid of padding, wire frames, and sometimes the hair of other people or animals. Imagine slowly drifting into sleep while visualizing a slightly itchy, highly structured hair tower perched atop one's skull. Makeup in Victorian times was both necessary and carefully veiled. The social expectation was subtlety. Too much rouge, and a woman might be labeled as vulgar or immoral. Too little, and she risked appearing unhealthy or socially inadequate. So, women employed light powders, faint tints for lips and cheeks, and minimal eye enhancement. The irony is quiet but omnipresent. The more socially acceptable your makeup, the more effort, precision, and sometimes toxic chemicals were required to maintain it. Meanwhile, dental hygiene had become more of a beauty concern than a health concern. Teeth whitening involved abrasive powders, chalk mixtures, or even early chemical bleaching agents. Some dental treatments could be mildly hazardous, but in polite society, a dazzling smile was worth the risk. The obsession with appearance had quietly shifted from purely social signaling to subtle physical optimization, though with a continued undercurrent of danger. Drifting toward the turn of the 20th century, the early 1900s introduced new technologies, and with them, new beauty extremes. The development of commercial cosmetics, chemical hair dyes, and more permanent hair removal techniques brought beauty into homes in unprecedented ways. Women experimented with a growing variety of chemical products. Hair dyes could contain coal tar, lead, or arsenic. Facial creams sometimes incorporated petroleum derivatives or other experimental compounds. The gentle, sleepy takeaway? Historical beauty routines never really eliminated risk. They just moved the danger from court-appointed artists to home applications. The Roaring Twenties, of course, brought their own kind of controlled chaos. Flappers adopted short haircuts, dramatic makeup, and pale skin achieved through commercial powders. Rouge became bolder, lip color more pronounced, and mascara, eyeliner, and eyebrow definition started to take forms closer to what we recognize today. But these cosmetics were still imperfect science. Mercury-based mascaras, leaded face powders, and other mildly poisonous ingredients quietly persisted. So while jazz filled the air and Charleston dances occupied the evenings, a quiet chemical experiment was unfolding nightly on thousands of faces. And yet, the obsession with aesthetics remained socially mandated. Pale skin, carefully sculpted brows, and cosmetically enhanced features weren't just about beauty. They were signals of wealth, leisure, and refinement. In a sense, the chemicals and discomfort were instruments of social communication. A carefully powdered face whispered in subtle monotone, "I am not a laborer. I am worthy of attention, marriage prospects, or polite conversation." It's fascinating, in a subdued, almost soporific way, to realize how much effort has always been quietly required to sustain the illusion of ease. Meanwhile, medicalized beauty treatments began to appear in clinics and parlors. Early forms of electrolysis removed hair permanently. If you survived the procedure without infection or irritation, facials sometimes involved acidic compounds to exfoliate skin, with varying degrees of safety. Even botanic concoctions could be hazardous if misapplied. It's a gentle reminder that the pursuit of aesthetic ideals has always flirted with danger, even as methods became more technologically advanced. Let's drift gently toward another facet: dieting. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, weight control became a central element of female beauty. Corsetry persisted in various forms, but now women were also encouraged to restrict food intake, exercise in carefully monitored ways, and maintain what was considered a delicate silhouette. Dietary restrictions often led to malnutrition, fainting spells, and subtle chronic fatigue. Yet, socially, these sacrifices were quietly celebrated as markers of refinement and self-discipline. And, of course, hair removal remained an obsession. Early 20th century techniques included chemical depilatories, razors, and rudimentary waxing methods. Pain, skin irritation, and chemical burns were common minor inconveniences. But the pursuit of smooth, hairless limbs was culturally demanded. It's almost soothing to imagine a quiet parlor, the faint smell of chemicals in the air, and women sitting patiently while discomfort passes slowly, silently, like a whispered story. Meanwhile, subtle social signaling persisted. The application of powder, rouge, and lip color was not merely aesthetic, it was communicative. Slight variations in hue could indicate marital status, social availability, or wealth. Eyebrows, eyelashes, and cheekbones were gently sculpted to meet the invisible demands of society. The quiet monotony of these practices belies their underlying complexity. It's fascinating in a sleepy, almost hypnotic way to imagine entire social lives, reputations, and opportunities hinging on the careful application of powders, creams, and chemical concoctions. Let's pause for a moment to float toward another subtle theme: the persistence of dangerous ingredients. Lead, mercury, arsenic, coal tar, and other heavy metals appear again and again, quietly proving that human vanity and chemical risk are deeply intertwined. Even as society advanced technologically, even as science promised safety and improvement, beauty often remained a hazardous enterprise. The sleep-inducing irony is that as methods became more modern, the danger didn't disappear. It just became quieter, less obvious, more insidious. And finally, before we drift into the next chapter of our gentle exploration, let's consider the emotional toll. Historical beauty standards have always been socially enforced. The constant need to conform, to maintain appearances, to signal status quietly and persistently, often weighed on individuals as much as physical discomfort. It's a gentle, slightly melancholy observation. The pursuit of beauty has always required endurance, patience, and a quiet willingness to accept risk, inconvenience, or even slow harm. So, as your eyelids grow heavier, imagine the softly glowing rooms of parlors, powdering stations, and bedrooms across centuries. Picture the faint scent of oils, perfumes, and chemicals, the subtle rustle of skirts and corsets, and the gentle monotony of carefully applied makeup and hair treatments. Every layer, every procedure, Every small discomfort tells a story of human desire, societal pressure, and the quiet, persistent longing to be admired. In our next part, we'll drift into mid-20th century innovations, Hollywood glamour, early plastic surgery, and the beginnings of mass-market cosmetics that quietly reshape society's perception of beauty. We'll see how risk remained, though perhaps in more socially invisible forms, and how ideals of attractiveness continued to evolve in a sleepy. All right, friends, let's gently glide into the mid-20th century, where beauty became not just a personal obsession, but a global spectacle. Picture softly lit movie sets, the quiet hum of cameras, and the meticulous preparation of actors whose faces were expected to remain flawless under the unforgiving gaze of the silver screen. Pull your blanket a little closer. Perhaps rest your chin on a pillow and imagine we are floating through the world of Hollywood glamour, quietly observing from behind velvet curtains. Hollywood in the 1930s through the 1950s was a universe defined by meticulous control of image. Actresses were expected to maintain perfectly sculpted faces, shiny hair, and slim silhouettes, all while projecting effortless charm. But behind the scenes, the effort was exhaustive. Makeup was often heavy, layered, and sometimes toxic. Foundations could contain lead or other chemicals intended to create a luminous effect under bright studio lights. Lipsticks, while dazzling on screen, occasionally contain trace amounts of arsenic or mercury, quietly persisting the centuries-old tradition of hazardous beauty. Hair was another carefully managed domain. Women used permanents, dyes, and sprays with chemicals that might make modern chemists shiver softly in their sleep. Curls were sculpted with metal rods heated over open flames, waving quietly in the soft hum of studio lights. It was a delicate balance. Beauty was a performance, and every inch of the face and hair was under scrutiny. A misplaced curl or smudge of rouge could quietly ruin a scene or, worse, a career. Meanwhile, dieting reached new levels of obsession. Actresses often adhered to highly restrictive eating patterns to maintain the appearance of delicate refinement. Some were quietly malnourished, though rarely publicly acknowledged. Slimness was equated with virtue, grace, and control, quietly continuing the centuries old association between physical appearance and social value. Beauty was not simply about aesthetics. It was a subtle social language, performed tirelessly under the bright scrutiny of society. Let's float gently to the quiet beginnings of cosmetic surgery. By the mid-20th century, procedures designed to enhance appearance were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Facelifts, nose reshaping, and eyebrow adjustments were performed in small clinics, often under conditions that today would seem primitive. Yet the emotional and social stakes were high. Maintaining an idealized appearance was no longer optional. It was a professional requirement for many women in Hollywood and high society. Pain, risk, and recovery were quietly endured, almost ritualistically, in the pursuit of societal approval. In parallel, the beauty industry was beginning its transformation into a mass-market phenomenon. Cosmetics became widely available, marketed to everyday women with promises of elegance, charm, and subtle power. Lipstick, foundation, powder, and eye makeup were sold with carefully crafted narratives, a quiet suggestion that refinement and personal influence could be achieved at home without the luxury of a studio or palace. Yet chemicals remained, albeit less overtly dangerous. Early formulations often contained ingredients like formaldehyde, coal tar, or other mild toxins, echoing the recurring theme that beauty has rarely been entirely safe. And then there was tanning, quietly becoming a symbol of health, leisure, and social mobility by mid-century. Whereas pale skin had been desirable for centuries, the post-war era subtly shifted preferences. A gentle sun-kissed glow indicated outdoor leisure, wealth, and modernity. Early tanning methods often involved oils, lamps, and later, ultraviolet devices, quietly adding another layer of potential harm. Yet, social signaling remained the same. Appearance was a performance, meticulously curated, quietly endured, and carefully maintained. Meanwhile, dieting and weight control took on even more regimented forms. Magazines began publishing guides, exercises, and recommended diets, often involving extreme calorie restriction or untested chemical supplements. Women quietly subjected themselves to these routines, sometimes risking malnutrition, fatigue, or fainting spells, all in the service of a socially mandated silhouette. The pursuit of beauty, it seems, was as relentless as ever, merely taking on more scientific, socially mediated forms. And of course, the mid-20th century also brought dramatic hairstyles, from victory rolls to sleek bob cuts. Hair was dyed, curled, teased, and sprayed into place with a quiet intensity. Hairspray often contained volatile chemicals, contributing to headaches, respiratory irritation, or a subtle sense of discomfort endured for aesthetics. But to contemporaries, these efforts were part of daily life, an unspoken obligation to conform to evolving standards of glamour. Moving into the 1960s and 1970s, we see further innovations, but also the continuation of quietly dangerous practices. Makeup became more colorful and bold, but chemical formulations, while increasingly regulated, still contained residues that could irritate skin or eyes. Diet culture intensified. With the rise of low-calorie trends, diet pills, and stringent exercise regimens, women endured these quietly, often balancing societal expectation with personal fatigue, sustaining beauty through persistent effort and small sacrifices. Let's pause to drift gently over a recurring theme: the persistence of risk. From lead powders in Rome to arsenic-laden lipsticks in Hollywood, human vanity seems to have a quiet relationship with danger. The substances, techniques, and social pressures may change, but the underlying pattern remains. Beauty is both a personal pursuit and a social performance, often quietly endured at some physical or emotional cost. And of course, we cannot ignore men. In these decades, male grooming practices became more socially significant. Haircuts, sideburns, and carefully applied hair products were markers of refinement and modernity. Subtle colognes, shaving products, and even hair dyes quietly communicated social awareness, status, or adherence to evolving norms. The pattern remains: appearance as silent social language, meticulously performed, often involving discomfort or minor hazards. Meanwhile, the fashion industry, media, and film continued to quietly reinforce ideals of beauty. Airbrushing, lighting, and selective photography created the illusion of effortless perfection, masking the exhaustive efforts behind the scenes. Dieting, makeup, hairstyling, and surgical enhancements became interwoven into daily life. And yet, The human impulse remained the same, the quiet desire to be admired, socially accepted, or considered refined. It's almost soothing to realize that, across centuries, these obsessions form a gentle continuum. By the late 20th century, innovations such as chemical peels, early Botox, and laser treatments quietly added layers of intervention. Beauty could be manipulated in more permanent ways, reducing some effort but introducing new risks, infection, scarring, or subtle long-term effects. The pursuit of aesthetic ideals, as always, was balanced against quiet danger, subtle discomfort, and the persistent pressures of society. Meanwhile, global beauty standards became increasingly homogenized through media and advertising. Pale skin, smooth limbs, slim physiques, and carefully sculpted features were reinforced worldwide. Diet culture intensified, cosmetic interventions expanded, and chemical formulations became increasingly sophisticated, yet still not entirely risk-free. It's a gentle, sleepy reminder that the pursuit of beauty has always been a dialogue between individual desire, societal expectation, and subtle risk. And as we drift softly toward the 21st century, the pace accelerates, but the patterns remain consistent. Cosmetic procedures, chemical formulations, digital manipulation, and aesthetic surgery continue to mediate the appearance of perfection. Social pressures persist, now amplified by global media, social platforms, and instant visibility. And yet, the fundamental story is familiar. The human desire to conform, to signal status, to be admired, quietly driving endurance, effort, and sometimes risk. So, as you slowly let your mind wander, imagine the arc from ancient Rome with lead powders and ash-dyed hair, through Heian Japan with ink-blackened teeth, to Victorian England with tight-laced corsets and chemically treated hair, to mid-20th century Hollywood with arsenic-laden lipsticks and elaborate hairdos. Every era, every culture, every individual quietly negotiating the balance between social expectation, personal desire, and physical consequence. It's a gentle, almost hypnotic rhythm. Beauty, risk, endurance, performance, repeated across centuries, continents, and social classes. In the next part, we'll drift into modern extremes, mass-market cosmetics, chemical cocktails, digital filters, cosmetic surgery, and contemporary beauty standards that quietly echo every historical obsession we've observed. For now, allow your imagination to settle in the quiet rooms, softly lit studios, and powder-scented parlors of centuries past, where human vanity quietly endures, softly persistent, and almost hypnotically timeless.